And the negative is like, well, you make a lot of great arguments why domestic violence is bad. Let's just have the abuser stop committing domestic violence. This is better. You don't have to kill people. What seems sort of strange about that is that the app can only have the victim do things. They're trying to get the victim to stop the abuser doing that. But if the negative can then just get up and have the abuser just stop abusing people, that seems problematic in a couple ways. Because obviously, that would be preferable to having to kill someone. But it seems like affirmatives should be allowed to win around. And if the negatives could do that, it'd be very difficult for them to do so. So what theory exists for is arguing that both debaters should be fair, and that both debaters should essentially have equal access to the ballot itself. There's another argument that we talked about in the intermediate group. I think it would also be helpful for explaining the use of the theory in this case. So, can someone explain what a necessary but insufficient verdict
is? It's like when you have to meet this requirement, but that's not the only requirement you have to meet. There's others.
Is it something you place on yourself?
No, under.
Yeah.
Isn't it that, like, if you meet this requirement, then you see your language and putting on the app? If you meet a certain burden as the app, you don't win, but you have to meet it to win.
Yeah, so let's give an example. So, say the affirmative reads a regular self-defense case. Then the negative is like, well, self-defense must be both proportional and must be imminent, meaning that the danger to you must be like about to happen very soon. You can't be like, well, maybe 10 years down the road, he's going there, someone who's going to be, it has to be like, it's happening right now. You have to defend yourself right now. That would be the imminent part. Proportionality is that you have to have a proportional response to the danger being done towards you. So the negatives is that those are two requirements in order for an action to be self-defense. If the affirmative gets up and only makes arguments in the one area about how they are proportional, they don't make any challenge to the imminence requirement, who wins the game? Yeah, the negative. They don't meet the requirement. If the affirmative just makes arguments about how the imminence requirement is met, and they make a lot of good arguments about how the victim is about to die from repeated domestic violence and they're in a very dangerous situation. But they don't speak to the question of proportionality. Who wins the round?
Negative.
The negative. So, in that situation, we have what's called a necessary insufficient verdict. It's something the affirmative has to do, so it's necessary, but it's not something that wins them the round. It's not sufficient for them to win. In that situation, again, it seems like then the negative could either just argue the affirmative is proportional in the NR, or just argue that their imminence requirements have failed to be met. So in those situations, there are necessary but insufficient verdicts, which make it much easier for the negative to win. Because if the affirmative splits their time and just argues and spends 2 minutes arguing that it's proportional and 2 minutes arguing that it's imminent, does negative have to answer all of those arguments? No. Why? Someone explain. You all just said no. That's the correct answer. So you must have some reason why you said that. Here.
They don't have to prove like both, aren't they? So they prove by one is the max, one's the things that win around. So they don't really be pointless like go after both. Just all the time, like really destroying like one of the reasons.
Yeah. Just like if the affirmative dropped one of the burdens in the one error, the negative only has to beat them back on one of those arguments. Because self-defense is not imminent, it's not self-defense, and it's impermissible. Or if it's disproportional, it's not self-defense, and it's not morally permissible. So, the negative has 2 ways to win. whereas the affirmative has to beat back both of those arguments in order to win the round. So, theory exists as a check against those types of practices. It's trying to equalize the way people have to access the ballot and ensure that debate remains an educational process. So, there's a lot of like very specific things that have to go to a theory argument. And a lot of what happens, which is somewhat unfortunate, but sort of necessary, is that theory debates become very, very technical. And there's a lot of very jargony concepts that people use. So please, if there's something that you don't understand, or like a word that one of us uses that just does not make any sense to you, please just raise your hand and ask a question. It is much more important that you understand the jargon concepts than to sort of mindlessly write down notes, write down the word if you don't know what it means.
Alright, so the first theory shell has 4 parts. And the first part is called the interpretation. And basically what that is that it's the rule that you want to set for the debate round. You can think of it as like the resolution, as if you're having a substantive debate. So, an interpretation is just something that both debaters, or one debater, depending on what it is, have to follow in order to not be a bad debater, right? Bad in the sense of like being like, unfair or cheating or whatever. And so, if you're going to have an example, right, against the necessary for the sufficient burden arguments, you would have to say something like all arguments must be necessary and sufficient for both debaters, or all burdens or all standards, something like that. And the problem is that when you're writing these, you have to be extremely specific and cover enough, or like be like extremely specific in your wording, so that they can't get out of it and say like, oh, I'm not doing that. I'm actually meeting in some kind of sketchy way.
Yeah. So, for example, in the necessary but insufficient burdens part of the debate, if your interpretation was just both sides must have the same number of ways to win, can someone say what might the negative debater say in that situation in order to meet the interpretation and mean that they haven't broken the rule? Well, what does it mean to affirm? It's in the abstract. Yeah.
Prove the resolution true.
Yeah. What does it mean to negate? There you go. There are both debaters have only one thing they need to do to win. The app has to prove the resolution true. The negative has to prove it false. And that would be a sufficient way to take out that argument if the rule for debate was just both debaters have equal ways to win. You have to be very specific in exactly what it means to have equal ways to win. Which, like the first example Josh said, you clarified by saying all burdens or all standards must be both sufficient and necessary for both debaters. So it can't be the negative and win one and win the round. The affirmative has to beat that and do something.
And another issue that you come across is that you don't want to use jargon like burden or things like that, because then they'll just be like, oh, this isn't a burden, it's a standard, and they'll say that they meet your interpretation, right? So you always have to be extremely specific to what you're talking about. Yes.
How do you warn like your argument and theory as just like their interpretation?
Yeah, we will get to that later. But yes, your theory shells do need to be warranted. That's an important point that a lot of people forget.
Yeah. So interpretations are the A point of a theory shell. There are 3 other points, so A, B, C, and D. Interpretation is the first one. When you're reading a shell, you just get it to say A, interpretation, read your interpretation. Then the next part of a theory shell, almost center exam, is the violation. So, can someone guess what that might mean just based on the word violation? Yeah.
How are the other debaters not meeting the interpretation?
Exactly. It's how they've broken the rule, how they're being cheated or being unfair. So,
And on the violation level, you want to be, again, you need to be extremely specific, and you should point out every single place that they're violating, and you should be extremely clear about like exactly how they're not meeting your interpretation, right? So on the necessary burden arguments with the imminence and proportionality arguments, you want to say their imminence burden violates my standard or violates my interpretation because not only do I have to show, or because I have to show that it's imminent, and I also have to show that it's proportional, but he can only do one of those and still win, right? You need to point out to the specific arguments on the flow. You don't just want to say, well, because I have to do two things and he can only do one, and then move on. You need to like point out exactly where they're violating. And one thing you should definitely think about is if you're planning to run theory, set up violations in CX so they're extremely clear. It's like he concedes that he does not meet my interpretation in cross-examination, so he doesn't meet it.
Like if they ran one of those necessary but sufficient burdens, you just be like, well, so as the affirmative, you can cross-examine the negative. Be like, well, so if I demonstrate that deadly force is proportional, do I win the round? And they'd be like, well, obviously not. You have to say why it's imminent as well. And you'd be like, oh, well, if I just said it's imminent, is that sufficient to win the round? And they'd be like, of course not. You have to also win the proportionality argument. And then if you really want to clarify further, you'd be like, well, so if you just win one of those arguments, do you win the round? And they'd be like, well, obviously I do. That's why I read the arguments. And then you sort of be like, oh, the one here is going to be very difficult. Or
And the violation gets easier the better your interpretation is. Because if your interpretation is just like both debaters must have equal chance to win or something like that, it's going to be extremely hard to point out why they're violating the interpretation. So the interpretation, the violation kind of go hand in hand, and that they should be very well written to the point where they can't just avoid it, and your violation is easy to make.
a good metric to use to see if your interpretation is as clear as it can be is that if someone only understands what you mean by certain words in the interpretation once they hear the violation, then you probably need to be more specific in the interpretation. Like if you said A interpretation, both debaters have equal ways to access the ballot. B violation, they have multiple ways to win. And you explain about the concept necessary for the sufficient burden there. It seems like you probably haven't been as clear as possible in the interpretation when you could isolate the fact about necessary and sufficient burdens, perhaps the fact that they're necessary but not sufficient, and then word your interpretation better. Mean that both debaters must have all burdens and criterions must be sufficient and necessary.
Alright, so we're going to change up the order for the theory shell. This is not how you should run it in round, but it makes more sense to talk about it this way. So we're going to move on to the D point next, which is the voter. And you can think of the voter as like the value of the shell, right? It is what you want to achieve most when you're talking about rules of debate.
A lot of people are confused by theory at first, and part of it is because the last two sections of the shell are backwards in the way regular cases are run. You have the standard section, which is the C point, that we're going to talk about after the voter, is really where you're making sort of like contention level arguments that they are being unfair. Just like you would make contention level arguments in a case about how the resolution action is moral or immoral. But then after you've explained how it's unfair, then you explain why the value of sorts is fairness. So it's somewhat strange, and usually this gets sort of confusing for people. This is why we're talking about it in the reverse order, because they understand. So the goal theory is trying to reach, which is in the voters, and then the way you get there is through the standards. But for whatever reason, people decided to read the standards first.
And the purpose of the voter is to give the judge a reason to find the shell important and either vote for you because of your shell or to get rid of certain arguments. So, like the implication of the voter could be these necessary bits of burdens are so bad that that kid needs to lose. Or it could be they're unfair, so just get rid of those two arguments, and then we can continue with that. A shell is just a theory argument, right? With the A, B, C, D, all of that is called a theory shell.
So does someone want to, what's your name? Ryan asked a really good question, which is a jargon term we've been using that we have not explained, so it's good you caught on. But does someone want to re-articulate what Ryan's question was and what our answer was? Make sure everyone's on the same page. Yeah.
He asked what a shell is, and a shell is basically just like the whole theory argument, like with its 4 parts.
Yeah. It's a very structured, very ordered way of presenting theory arguments. You'd literally say, as a negative debater or something, I will read 2 theory shells. That would be a roadmap for the round. And then you read A, interpretation, B, violation, C, standard, D, voter. Then you read the next one. That's what a theory shell is. The A through D points.
And a lot of judges will, I think the overwhelming majority of judges will only listen to theory when it's made in shell form, right? So you always have to have those 4 parts in order for it to be deemed important enough for them to vote on.
Which might seem sort of strange because you're just making an argument, but just like if you read a regular case that may have had arguments about a criterion, but didn't actually say the words, my criterion is, a lot of judges would be like, well, what's your standard? I don't understand what your case is trying to do. So there's structure to a theory argument, just like there are structure to regular cases. It's just that structure to a theory argument is a lot more fair. But it's basically the same.
Alright, and every voter basically needs 2 arguments. The first argument it needs is why it precedes substance. And what substance is it's like all the other arguments, right? Every debate argument that we've talked about up to this point at camp is substantive debate, right? The contentions, value criterion, all of that is on substance.
Substantive debate is about the resolution, whether it's moral or immoral, just or unjust. Theory debate is not. It's about what you've done in the round and whether that is beneficial for debate as an activity as a whole.
And so the voter needs to show why the judge should care about theory and fairness or education or whatever you're talking about before they look to who's proved the resolution true or false.
If your opponent read a bunch of necessary events been converted, and you were like, these are really unfair, but didn't say why you should evaluate that before those arguments, then your opponent would be like, well, you should just vote for the resolution true or false first. But if you can't decide, then maybe you can think about theory. That would seem very unfortunate because the U.S. affirmative will have a very difficult time clearly proving the resolution true. Because the negative has 2 ways to win the round, while you only have 1. So you want to make sure that this part is very clear as to why fairness or education is going to precede substantive evaluation. I'll give 2 examples of those arguments in a second after we explain what these terms fairness and education are about.
And the second part that a voter needs, other than why it precedes fairness, is it needs to explain why the voter means they should either vote for you because of it, or why they should reject and get rid of certain arguments in the round, right? So you don't only need to appeal to ideas like fairness or education, and then say these are more important than substantive debate. You also need to explain why that means either you just cross the necessary but insufficient burden arguments off your flow, or why you vote against the person you're debating.
Yeah, this is somewhat paradoxical again, because a voter could either be a reason to vote for you, or just a reason to reject certain arguments. Don't really know why it's been called a voter in that case, but that's what they decided it shall be called. So the 2 voters that are by far the most common, and really the only ones people run, are fairness and education. Education is probably the simpler of the 2. to explain. So, why might education be important in debate? Someone make some arguments about that. Yeah.
Debate is an educational activity.
Exactly. That's the exact phrase that all education voters use. I could say that's good. Debate is an educational activity. So what good debate is a kind of debate that provides education.
Yeah. Hopefully, you guys are all here to learn things about the world, how to make arguments. That is what debate is trying to be. So, if someone is being uneducational, why might that be a bad thing? I'm trying to be like specific, explaining why. So someone say yes. Yeah.
Because they're not learning.
You're not learning from the round. But presumably, if you're reading the arguments, you're fine with that. So, what else might you be intruding on besides your own learning?
It's like I guess running an abuse argument, like a word pick or something, which focuses on one part of the solution. You could say it's including the other debater's ability to debate other parts of the solution. I'm focusing similar to their thing, limiting my ability to learn.
So I like the second part of that answer. We're talking about how it harms the opponent's learning. I think we want to stay away from particular examples right now, so we can just understand what a voter is, sort of in isolation. So, what he said is very important at the end of that, which is that you stop your opponent from learning. The debate round is not just one person ranting about domestic violence. There's an opponent in the round all the time, and if what you're doing harms education, then you're also harming someone else's education, even if you are fine with not being educated, you get to win rounds. So it seems like you're placing these external costs on other people who might be in debate to learn about issues and to have these types of intellectual discussions, when you're just like, well, I just want to win, and I want to win as quickly as possible, something like that. So, we've explained why what might be bad for you harming someone else's education. Can someone perhaps give a reason as to why that should be a voting issue? This question is probably the most difficult one to ask in a theory debate. But, so say there's your opponent and you're harming their learning, and then the next round hits someone else who also prevents them from learning by being abusive, and then the next round, and the next round. What do you think that person would do if they came to debate to learn, but everyone was stopping them from doing that? What did you say?
I said,
Yeah, they would just stop debating. Because their goal for the activity is sort of vanished. So, an explanation of a voter might be that if people are harming education, then that would cause other people to leave the activity because they are no longer learning.
And then, so that's a good argument for why people should be, or why like violations of education or someone being bad or limiting education is a bad thing, right? And so, what do you think could be an argument for why not only should they just get rid of certain arguments, but why they should drop that debater as like so they cannot do anything else, right? And they just vote on the show. Yeah.
I guess with debate implications, if you drop the debater, that'll like make them less inclined to do it again
Exactly.
because they just want to win.
Yeah. So all they want to do is win. And so if they start losing because of these necessary but insufficient burden arguments, then they'll probably stop running in the future, right?
Yeah. The deterrence type of argument that making someone lose discourages them and other people like watching the round and hear about the round from doing the same types of things is very important to most theory voters. Yeah, because even if you just like throw away some of the arguments, if the negative made those two burdens that the affirmative has to demonstrate that proportional and meet the image requirement, but also had some like offensive arguments against the AC that were reasons why using deadly force like causes the backlash that it will fail, and then the abuser becomes even more violent. If all you did did was just throw out those two arguments, the negative could be like, okay, I'm sorry, I never realized that my arguments were incredibly uneducational. You can throw away those requirements, but I still win on the AC. It seems like that would be unfortunate because the negative is still winning the round, and you've wasted a lot of your time making these theory arguments. But if you have to see that if affirmative debater wins the round because the negative is being uneducational, then the negative could really never make those arguments again if they didn't want to lose on the theory debate. Yeah.
So then since we made clear that a big deal is the fact they are eating free time, because they're eating free time making a theory debate, you should punish them for it.
Well, like the argument about that you said about they made you run theory is a good way to say that, like, because you're having to engage in the theory debate, not only is it being uneducational, but it's also like skewing your time, so you have less time to debate on the case or on like the arguments on like your AC or NC, and so that would be a way to explain why you should not only reject the arguments but reject the debater, because you had to run theory because otherwise you were going to lose or not be educated, and by them making you run theory, you did not have time to win on other parts of the book.
Yeah, like because you have spent so much time articulating this theory show, you didn't have time to answer those offensive arguments on the AC that were about how using deadly force laps with that make these moves work. You have spent so much time answering their burdens and explaining why they should go away that you would just lose on other parts of the game. So there should be a voting issue, not smooth for direct arguments. That would be an example of an argument like that. But I don't think it quite gets at why theory should be. Yeah, so just needs to be a little bit more specific in the implications.
So now let's go on to the other voter, which we've hinted at, which is fairness. So who thinks they can define what fairness is for a debate round?
We can start with the definition of what fairness might be in general. No one's ever heard the word fairness?
Yes.
Just like.
Yeah. Like what she said about equality is extremely important, right? That fairness is essentially that both sides have like equal ability to win, right? Whether that's defined by whether they have to win 2 burdens or the other person has to win 1, so it's unfair, or like I need the ability to, as the negative, to talk about like the imminence doctrine, or else I can't win because all of the other negative literature is really bad. Then that would also be a violation of fairness, right? Because they can't make the arguments in the first place. Does that distinction make sense to anyone? Over you say. So there are 2 kinds, basic ideas of fairness, right? There's like procedural fairness, in that like the burden is either like you have to do 2 things, or I have to do 2 things, you have to do 1. And then there's also the kind of like fairness in terms of like what arguments you can run in the first place, or like what types of like topic literature you can run. So like, is the app limited to only running self-defense cases, or do they also justify why like revenge is important, right? And so if the app says I need to be able to run my revenge ground or my revenge arguments, or else the round is unfair. That is another type of fairness. But they're both basically trying to achieve competitive equity or equal ability to win for both winners. Yeah.
What were the 4 sections of the fair show? Voter, interpretation, violation.
So can someone, so I think those would be all of them, but can someone say what the order they go in the show? Yeah.
It's A, B, C, D, interpretation, violation, standards, and voter.
Correct. And we have not quite gotten to the standards yet. Talked about the voter, but that's why we're looking at clear.
Yeah. What was the second type of fairness? Like procedural.
I don't know what word to call it, but I guess it would just be like. I mean, it's called like ground, but like what ground basically means is like what arguments from the topic literature or that have to do with the topic you can run, right? So that's normally used as a standard, right? Like the type of discussion between procedural or or like the ground fairness normally comes in the standards debate, right? And they link to fairness, they link to the voter in different ways.
Yeah, the important part to take from the fairness voter is this idea of competitive equity and some sort of equality is what fairness appeals to. That if one debater has, so competitive equity, both debaters need equal ways to win the round, equal opportunity, is another phrase people use. And then we need to have rules enforced in order to ensure that this is actually something the debate has. Competitive equity, equal opportunity to win, so rules ensuring that must be enforced. The other thing is that voters, just like a value of morality or something, doesn't change between what different cases you run. You make the same arguments for why fairness is a voter in all of the different types of shells you run. Just like you make the same arguments for why morality is the value in all the resolutions that are about like have like the word often. So what this means is that a lot of the times it's best to work and again making sure you know a specific justification, a specific articulation of both voters, fairness and education. And that's something that you think you're confused about in this lecture. I think it is certainly very helpful if you try to work this out at like a camp or something, and make sure you have a specific justification for why fairness is a voter, and why it precedes substantive debate, why education is a voter, and why it precedes substantive debate. Because those are arguments you're going to be making in every single theory shell. There is no theory shell that will not contain one of those two arguments. And if you have a good understanding of those, it will be very far along in the theory debate. Because all it will take is just explaining how your opponent violates those concepts.
So now let's get into the third and final part of the four-part theory shell, which is a little bit confusing because we reverse the order. But the third part, which is these standards. And what these standards are is that they're reasons to prefer your interpretation that link to fairness or education. Right? So these standards is where you really get to the crux or the important part of the theory debate, where you say they're necessary but insufficient burden arguments are unfair for these reasons. And these arguments are linked to fairness or they link to education and the reasons why they're and so
okay, so once again, so remember that the voter is sort of like the value and standards were like the criteria, but people decided to flip those for their real theory arguments. Internal to the standards, debaters have once again flip the arguments around. Because the first thing you do in a standard is explain how they violate the standard. So you say, C standards, the first one is time skew. They have skewed my time because I have to answer both their necessary but insufficient burdens before I can win the round, so I have to waste time answering those back. And only then I generate offensive arguments to win me the round. Then you would justify why the standard links to the value of the voter. You'd be like, well, time is the fairness because time is the only limit we have in debate, and I can't make arguments outside of time limits, so they're taking my time. They're being unfair because I have less opportunity to win. So once again, you have, within a standard, you first make sort of contention level arguments about how they violate the standard, and then justify why the standard links to the value of the voter.
And one thing that's really good to do when you're making links to the voters is to link to both fairness and education. Because if they respond to one of those, then you also have the ability to access the other and be like, well, even if fairness isn't important, I'm still showing you why they violate education, which is still shown to be important.
Okay. So let's break down the arguments a little bit and what it would mean to articulate a standard. So, Vicky, in your explanation of what fairness was, you said, well, both players need equal opportunity to win, so they have to have equal grounds. What did you mean by ground?
Well, we both have to be able to like argue the same things, but say like the app, like paramedic decided like maybe.
So I think you're going to try and explain this without using any fairness. So what is the concept of?
Just like the amount of argument.
Yeah, that's a great definition. So ground is the amount of arguments you can make. It also includes a measure of the quality of those arguments. So, say the affirmative decided that, well, or sorry,
If you're debating, you're still dealing with all of it, especially if you do actually violate whatever interpretation you have. Could you just explain why the voter doesn't matter instead of going through each standard or each part of the vote?
We will get into answering theory in the next theory lecture, but just in general, I would say that it's not that you want to answer it in as many places as possible.
or education is one of the this current trends in schools of the So we were talking about ground. So ground is an example of a standard. So why might it be important for both debaters to have equal amounts of ground, meaning both debaters to have equal amounts of arguments and quality of those arguments in a debate round? Yeah.
So they both have equal access to the ballot.
Why is that critical to getting equal access to the ballot?
Because that way the debate is really important. You can go both ways.
It seems like you're getting close to what it would be. It's something that happens a lot in theory debate. It's that really what you have to do is justify why debate is important, or how you can have good debate, which most people just take as sort of intuitive, and it becomes a lot of times very difficult to explain why it is that is key to fairness, unless you have experience making those kinds of arguments. Does everyone know what I mean when I say X is key to Y? Can someone explain that real quick? Yeah.
You need X to accomplish Y.
Yeah, so saying ground is key to fairness means that we need to have ground in order to have fairness. So that phrase means. So we're talking about why it might be important for both debaters to have equal ground. So, how is it that you win debate rounds? Is it the person who throws the most money at the judge and gets them to vote for them? That should not be what you're doing. All of you guys think that is okay. That is a problem. So, can someone explain to me how it is? This is a very simple question, and perhaps more difficult to answer because it's simple. How it is that you get a judge to vote for you? Yeah.
You do the better debating.
Do the better debate. What does it mean to do the better debate? Is it the person who threatens the judge with the most amount of physical pain if they don't vote for them? Yeah. I would never want to debate.
Maybe fulfilling a resolutional burden.
Fulfilling a resolution.
How exactly do you achieve that? How do you fulfill your resolution?
Through the case itself.
Yeah, just by making arguments that link back to the resolution, right?
Okay, so show clear connections as to why your case is going to, I guess, affirm or negate a particular part of the resolution.
Yeah.
Yeah. You win rounds by making arguments.
Oh.
That's how you win debate rounds. And you can see it's sort of difficult to answer this question just because it's so simple. And that when you're articulating a ground argument, how they like perhaps taken your ground or decreased the quality of your ground, that really the argument is simply that I need to make arguments to win. And they're taking away my best arguments.
And so, if like your ground is limited to the point where you don't have the ability to make arguments that are any good, or you just don't have the ability to make any arguments at all, then there's probably a fairly good chance you're going to lose the round, right? Because if all of the arguments you're limited to making are really bad, then there's not a good chance you're going to be able to win, right? So both sides need to have good ground, or the ability to make both a good number of and good quality of arguments in order for both sides to be able to win in the first place.
Okay. So let's say the affirmative says, well, I can win the round by just showing that at least one victim should kill their abuser. That's all I need to do. And then they're like, well, I think that it is more for victims to kill abusers who are suicidal, they're very depressed, and that they want to die already. And then they explain that this means they would consent to the deadly force placed upon them. So, does anyone know what negative argument that the negative could no longer run? This is an argument in the demo round, who's with the intermediate. So, what was the negative case in the demo round for intermediate? Yeah.
Oh, it would take out their argument that says that like you can't impede a person's like outer freedom.
Yeah, some sort of freedom argument, some sort of autonomy argument, perhaps a more deontological position.
Yeah.
And they could no longer make that because the abuser was consenting to the deadly force being used on them. So, in this case, you might make an argument that the affirmative, just defending one instance, has taken away your ground to make that particular argument. And if you explain why this deontological position, or the position about outer freedom, is very important negative ground, perhaps because the rest of negative ground is kind of terrible, you'd have a theory argument as to why they have skewed your ground by taking away certain arguments to the ground.
And so, not only do you need to point to why, like they took this ground away from you, right? You don't only have to say they took my respect people's choices ground from me, right? You also have to show why that is important, right? So you need to show, and being able to talk about respecting people's outer freedom is extremely important for fairness because it's really the only good negative literature on this topic. Or you need to say it's important for education because then we are able to run like Kantian philosophy, whereas otherwise we would not have the ability to do that. Right?
And then, so specifically, I think something that John pointed out well is articulating why the particular ground you lost is important. Let's say the negative makes the two arguments against self-defense. Self-defense must be both proportional and imminent, and you have a theory argument that says they should lose for running those arguments. What arguments can the negative no longer run? What arguments do they no longer have access to? Yeah. Exactly. You are preventing them from running those two arguments. So, anytime you say someone has done something bad in the debate round, on some level, you are preventing them from making certain arguments. So, you need to be prepared to explain why those particular arguments for stopping them from running are irrelevant, or why the trade-off for arguments that they are preventing you from running are important. It's important to be as specific as possible when you're articulating a ground standard.
And another thing you need to think about when you're writing your standards is don't only make them specific to like what they did in the round, but you need to try and make them as specific, like tied to your interpretation, right? So if your interpretation is like something like necessary, insufficient burden, or bad, I mean that would not be your interpretation, but that's the gist of what it is. And then you have a violation that says they do them here and here. Your standards need to say why the interpretation itself violates or is good for fairness for education, not their argument on my second contention is bad for fairness for education. So you need to talk about your interpretation rather than the specific arguments that they were making.
The way you can think about an interpretation which influences how the standards are structured and warranted, and then interpretation is a rule that all debate rounds should follow. This is an articulation of something that everyone should do in order for there to be good debate. So if you just talk about what happened in your particular round, you're not really getting at why the interpretation might be a good thing. Because if the interpretation is used in a different round, those arguments might not be there. And so that particular instance needs to be explained as to how, as a general rule, we should follow your interpretation.
So your arguments should be saying all necessary for an insufficient burden is so bad, instead of they're necessary for insufficient burden is bad. Does that make sense? So can someone explain to me why it's important to talk about your interpretation rather than just the particular violation? No one understood the importance of just being more general about it. Yeah.
So you can apply it across different situations.
Yeah. So the reasons to prefer your interpretation, which are what the standards are, can be used and universalized to all debate rounds that would ever happen. Right? It's not only for this round; it's for all debate rounds that no one should ever run necessary for this issue.
So we've talked a lot about ground and how ground is measured both in terms of the quantity of arguments you can make and the quality of those arguments, and how you can be very specific about it. But a lot of other theory standards as well, and it would help to measure those. So, does anyone have any examples or guess at what other kinds of theory standards might be? All right, that's fine.
Right.
So,
What about time skew?
Yeah. Time skew is, or why would time skew be important?
It'd be important because the model would be fairness because you wouldn't have the same time to answer arguments if you have all these different burdens and it wouldn't be fair.
Yeah. So we need time to be able to make arguments. So if they're skewing your time, not like so you have to spend time on some stuff and losing time to make arguments other places, then you're going to lose regardless of how good you are simply because you're running out of time. All right, Luke, did you have one?
Yeah, I was going to say time skew.
All right.
so can someone explain the argument on this game? Why time skew is important? How about that guy next to you? Yeah. Your game and you. Yeah. Okay. So, so can you explain why time skew is important?
Time skew is important because it limits the amount of arguments you can make in a certain round. For example, if you can skew that time, then you have less time in order to answer the arguments that your opponent made. So it's unfair because you won't be able to answer.
So does that mean like your opponent stood up during one of your arms like blah 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 blah?
No, it means that they basically, for example, they could have gotten rid of some arguments that you've read unfairly by, for example, if they read necessary but insufficient burdens in their NC that will come before your AC, then they've effectively gotten rid of your first 6 minutes of speech.
Sure. That's a good explanation of how one might violate time skew. So, do you have a question? So let's really quick finish up discussion about time skew. Yeah. So the argument that James gave was that if the NC standard comes like before the affirmative case, then the app can't use arguments from the AC or repeat back the negative case. So they skew down their time on that level. We have another 10 minutes. Okay.
So does anyone know any other standards? Yeah.
Predictability.
Yeah. So why would predictability be important?
Because you're expected to know the one to run certain arguments that you don't expect them walking in the round talk about dolphins. You assume they're going to talk about domestic violence and knowledge permissibility.
Okay, and why is what you expect them to run important in terms of you like doing well at the graph.
Okay, can you repeat the question?
Why is you being able to predict or expect them to be able to run important for your ability to do well in the graph?
It makes it fair.
Why?
Because if you don't know what they're running, you can't possibly go to be ready and have arguments.
Yeah, you can't get ready for it, right? You know, like debate is you have to do research, right, and prepare responses to common negative positions or common affirmative positions, right? So if the app is going to talk exclusively about people killing their abusers when the abusers want to commit suicide, you couldn't really have seen that one coming, right? So you probably don't have very good arguments prepared for why that would be why that would still be a bad thing, right? So being able to prepare before the round is really important to you to be able to win. Yeah.
Someone's running like a discursive K run here, you can't say which one comes first.
That is a very specific question that I don't really have time to get to this lecture, but I think we'd be more than happy to talk about that.
All right, so who can explain to me why predictability is important?
Yeah. So prepare. Why is it important? Why is it important to be So, if you've never heard an argument before, is it impossible for you to do it? But is it easier or harder for your opponent? They know it's coming. You don't know it's coming. Easier. Yeah. So, if the affirmative made a similar argument that I can win the round, they just draw in one instance, and they're like, well, there's this person. Her name is Sally. She should be able to kill her abuser. There are like over 7 billion people in the world right now. And if the affirmative, or the negative, sorry, was expected to have arguments prepared as to why each and every individual person should not be allowed to use deadly force, that would be an absurd research burden place upon them. You have to like do phone interviews with everyone, get tracking them down, talking to them, making sure you know why they should be able to use deadly force. And seeing as y'all are high school students, that would be exceptionally difficult.
I'm curious, the idea of like predictability being bad, isn't that very closely tied to topic arguments and ground? Because you can't just say, oh, I've never heard the argument before, so it's unpredictable, which is bad. You have to say it's non-topically, so it's unpredictable, or take
So that's using a lot of jargon words in a very short amount of time. I think that we explain a little more about predictability, we'll sort of get the answer to your question. But if you are still confused, feel free to come to us.
So, to use Grant's example, if you're talking about Sally Smith killing her husband, right? That's fully within the binds of the topic, right? It's a victim of domestic abuse killing their abuser using deliberate deadly force. But it's so specific that you had no chance to see it coming, right? So it's not a topicality or like whether they're actually talking about the resolution so they're not predictable. Because you can be talking about the resolution, but still be making arguments that you can't predict.
Yeah. So the important distinction being that the affirmative knows the argument is coming. They know they're going to read an AC about Sally Smith because they're writing that AC. You as the negative have no idea that's coming. So if the affirmative is able to know it's coming, they're able to prepare arguments. Prepared arguments are probably best to do it in time guessing. The arguments they get in prep time are oftentimes not very good. So that might be a reason why it makes it unfair, be unpredictable. We don't know when it's coming, and your opponent didn't prepare arguments. So that debate much easier.
So now let's try and link predictability to education. Because all the voters we've been talking about have been, let's go.
Alright, so very briefly, later today, you're going to see a demo debate where it will read some theory shells, and it'll use that demo debate as a way to frame how to answer theory shells in the next lecture. So, be prepared to see arguments about how we beat back theory shells and an argument like and how that